Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining our fourth and final event in Enterprise's webinar series focused on eviction prevention. I'm Michelle Wetton, Vice President and Gulf Coast Director at Enterprise Community Partners, and I'm honored to be part of a fantastic, dedicated team of mission-driven Enterprise staff. Enterprise is a national nonprofit housing organization that works coast to coast and is focused on three organization-wide priorities: to increase housing supply, advance racial equity, and build resilience and upward mobility. We create and preserve affordable homes. We own and operate rental homes. We advocate policy and best practices that drive systems change. We operate on a national scale alongside thousands of local partners with an on-the-ground presence in urban and rural communities across the country. It has never been more important to focus on efforts to prevent eviction and ensure that every family has a stable home that they can afford. This four-part webinar series is generously supported by JPMorgan Chase Company. In this series, we look at the nexus between eviction prevention and housing preservation, preventing evictions through the legal system, the role of landlords as stewards of affordable housing, and moving upstream to prevent evictions. Today's session will focus on strategies that can address housing instability further upstream of the eviction process, as well as address some of the enduring systemic racism in housing that has left communities of color disproportionately impacted by evictions and housing instability. Evictions have negative consequences for everyone: renters, landlords, and communities. However, we know that BIPOC renters, and Black women in particular, face the heaviest burdens. On top of the trauma eviction causes families who are at risk of experiencing homelessness, it also doesn't make economic sense. We know that it is more cost-effective to keep people housed. This pandemic has brought to light the deep structural inequities, and we should all be focused on not just preventing evictions, but making fundamental changes that enable housing stability for all families so that they are much less likely to reach a state of crisis in the first place. Today, I'm honored to be joined by an amazing set of speakers who will discuss a range of strategies that can improve housing security, including systemic changes that can help us avoid intergenerational cycle of poverty that limits the potential of so many Americans. Thank you to our speakers and to the more than 900 registrants listening in today. To welcome you to today's discussion, I'm happy to introduce Mercedes Mortazavi, who is Vice President of Global Philanthropy with JPMorgan Chase. JPMorgan Chase is a critical supporter and partner of Enterprise. We thank them for their support of this webinar series. Mercedes and the team at JPMorgan Chase have shown industry leadership in their affordable housing and racial equity work, including with their recent commitment to improve housing stability and affordability for Black, Hispanic, Latino, and other underserved households. Mercedes.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. I'm Mercedes Mortazavi with the JPMorgan Chase Foundation, leading our national neighborhood development work. At JPMorgan Chase, we really recognize that financial institutions must play an integral role in supporting a more inclusive economy. We believe that we must work in partnership across private, public, and nonprofit sectors to really address structural challenges. We all know the affordable housing crisis we are in that has been exacerbated by COVID, and we've launched a firm-wide strategy to address these systemic challenges. To name some of our commitments, last year, the firm made a $30 billion commitment to advance racial equity, which included a significant focus on affordable housing and homeownership for Black, Latino, and Hispanic households. And we are now building on these business commitments with a 5-year, $400 million philanthropic commitment that we announced this past June. We're also advancing data-driven policy recommendations that will increase the availability and equitable access to affordable housing. Because of today's topic, I wanted to provide a bit more detail into our housing stability work. A few weeks ago, we announced over $8 million to 6 nonprofit organizations to promote immediate housing stability for households of color. These investments are supporting sustainable eviction diversion and community lawyering models that advance racial equity and demonstrate applicability for wider policy change. In conjunction, our Policy Center has outlined solutions in support of evidence-based policy reforms that improve household stability. For example, just to name a few, the firm is supporting policies that implement fair eviction standards to help ensure stability and improve outcomes for both tenants and landlords, and reduce preventable evictions by establishing eviction diversion programs, applying eviction principles such as right to counsel that protect tenants from unlawful eviction, and helping ensure a balanced and predictable eviction process. Lastly, I just wanted to reiterate and note that we are also proud supporters of this webinar series and Enterprise's eviction prevention tool. These commitments and policy solutions are examples of how we are advancing racial equity and helping drive an inclusive economic recovery. Because an inclusive economy in which there is equal access to opportunity is a stronger, more resilient economy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mercedes, for your sponsorship of this series and your leadership in this industry. Now it is my honor to introduce Mayor Latoya Cantrell, who I am proud to say is my own mayor here in New Orleans. First, I want to congratulate the mayor on a resounding re-election to a second term over the weekend. Her commitment to the people of this city and her message that despite her many first-term accomplishments, she is only getting started was recognized in these election results. Mayor Cantrell has brought a deep understanding of housing, community development, and the needs of people with low income to her administration. Before getting into politics, she started and led a community-based organization that spearheaded redevelopment efforts in her own neighborhood that was devastated by the flooding following Hurricane Katrina. As mayor, she has worked to identify every possible tool and resource available to creatively tackle the city's affordable housing needs from every angle. And the city's first ever inclusionary zoning ordinance was enacted during her first term. Mayor Cantrell's team has recently received recognition for strong performance distributing rental assistance funding to residents and landlords affected by the pandemic. Particularly relevant to today's conversation, Mayor Cantrell recently announced a basic income pilot to help young people in New Orleans build wealth and financial literacy. Mayor Cantrell, thank you so much for being here today and sharing your vision for creating a more equitable New Orleans.
No, thank you, Michelle, and also to Mercedes, thank you very much. Just a pleasure to be with everyone here today, and I'd like to thank JPMorgan Chase and Enterprise community partners for hosting. And, you know, Michelle, that's how we got to know each other in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. You hitting the ground running with Enterprise, and I just appreciate your unwavering leadership. Welcome everyone to this very important webinar that includes so many topics and localities across the United States of America. New Orleans is absolutely one of the cities on the front lines of eviction crises. And we've been at the forefront working very hard to stem off evictions and the impacts that it truly has on our people. We know that we cannot achieve housing stability simply by building our way out of this affordable housing crisis. We must address evictions head on. And if I can just take a moment to highlight some of the emergency rental assistance program work that we've done here in the city of New Orleans. We've gotten about 32 million out of the door that served over 8,000 households. Another 1,000 households have been pre-approved and waiting in queue for an additional federal resources that are coming our way from the state, transferred from the state of Louisiana. The city will receive an additional 30 million more in rental assistance from the state because of our ability to get the funds out of the door and into, you know, the hands of our folks so that they're not evicted. New Orleans was recognized, and Michelle mentioned this recently, by the U.S. Department of Treasury as being one of the high-performing leaders in getting money to households that need it the most. And we were granted an additional 9.6 million because of those efforts. We're working very hard with our courts and legal aid partners. We have a help desk at eviction court so that, you know, the city can intervene when tenants are facing evictions, and we can immediately know who they are, and we can stop it in midstream, quite frankly. We work with tenants as well as the landlords on site at the court to get them to the top of the list to help the tenant stay housed. And so again, meeting both the tenant side of it and the landlord side of it. The Louisiana State Bar Association awarded the city and the First Circuit Court with the 2021 Innovation Award for the city's eviction diversion program. And this is what what I just mentioned. We intervened in about 500 households stopping eviction. So that's a big deal. And we're excited about that work, but we need to keep it going. In 2022, the city will have funding in place for the right to counsel. So if someone finds themselves in court facing eviction proceedings, they will be afforded a legal representation, because we know that we have to meet our people where they are, and they need the right to counsel, and they need counsel present. But I also want to highlight some other exciting work to meet our folks where they are as well. And so the city is launching its first, and Michelle mentioned this, a universal basic income pilot with a $500,000 grant from the mayors for guaranteed income. We partnered with mayors, and particularly Mayor Tubbs at the time, about a year ago. It took us a good 9 to 10 months to get it off the ground, but we're so excited that we were able to launch it in partnership with others like MasterCard, and Mocafy. So we're excited about that. We'll be targeting opportunity youth between the ages of 16 and 24, and those who are not in school or not connected to the workforce. It will be a 10-month pilot in which 125 opportunity youth will be participating. And in addition, 150 opportunity youth will be included in a parallel support program for a total of 275 participants. So we're just trying to be as innovative and creative as possible. We're leveraging these resources, again, to meet our folks where they are, and particularly these 16 to 24-year-old residents in our city. We're partnering also with community-based organizations to link us to organizations on training programs that specifically serve our youth as well. We know that Americans are experiencing economic fragility and living paycheck to paycheck before the pandemic. So we only know it's gotten worse since the pandemic, and we're now into this almost 2 years now. Our social safety net, not sufficiently, it hasn't changed. Really, it's gotten even worse, and nearly 40% of our Americans are unable to afford a single $400 a month in terms of an emergency. This is a problem we have. And so my administration has continuously taken a all tools in the toolbox approach, because we know that when we talk about meeting people where they are, it takes multiple tools, because wherever people find themselves is where we want to be able to meet them. And so that toolbox is vitally important. We know that there's no silver bullet at all, but I tell you, webinars like the one that we're having right now are great opportunities to share ideas and to innovate amongst ourselves and partners and practitioners that are on the ground doing the work every single day and in spite of a pandemic. So I want to say thank you for your work. Thank you for being on this webinar and sharing, so that we can make sure that Americans throughout our country are served by the same focus of meeting them where they are. So thank you again for including me and my team.
Thank you so much, Mayor Cantrell, for your ongoing commitment to addressing income inequality and the housing needs of New Orleanians, and especially for taking time to be with us here today, just a few days after the election. We look forward to working with you to continuing your work to support the investments in housing stability and keep families stably housed so they can focus on their futures. I would now like to turn it over to Flora Arabou, Enterprise's National Senior Director for State and Local Policy, who will introduce our panelists as well as a new resource that Enterprise is proud to release today.
Great, thank you, Michelle. And again, our deep thanks to Mayor Cantrell for her leadership and her commitment, and a congratulations again on her reelection. So as everyone knows, today we're here to talk about upstream prevention strategies to address the root causes of the eviction crisis. I'm so excited about our panel of experts, but before I introduce them, I just want to provide a quick sneak preview of a new tool that Enterprise will be releasing in the coming days. It's an in-depth report on eviction that makes the case for upstream prevention. It includes an exhaustive literature review and case studies, and is meant to assist policymakers, practitioners, and advocates in demonstrating the impact and cost savings of upstream prevention solutions that lead to healthier households and stronger communities. And most importantly, it contains a really comprehensive catalog of policy and programmatic solutions that governments, courts, nonprofits, advocates, even developers can implement to keep people stably housed and prevent eviction at every stage of the process, from the triggering financial event all the way through a potential writ of execution. And the tool is written for a very wide range of audiences interested in the same outcomes: housing stability and eviction prevention. It will be shared with all of today's attendees in the coming days. And of course, as you know, this is being recorded, and we'll be sharing lots of materials with you, including the recording after the webinar. So now it's my pleasure to introduce our exciting panel. I'd ask all of the panelists to please turn their videos on so we can introduce you. Just so that the audience knows, each speaker is going to have an opportunity to talk about upstream prevention strategies and addressing the root causes of the eviction crisis. And after their remarks, we'll move into a Q&A session with the audience. So I encourage all of you to put your questions into the Q&A box. We'll be monitoring that, and we'll get to as many questions as we can after the panelists have spoken. All right, so first let me introduce everyone. Today we have Mirta Santana. Mirta is the Chief Program Officer at Riseboro Community Partnership in New York City. Mary Cunningham, who is the Vice President of the Metropolitan Housing and Community Centers at the Urban Institute in Washington, D.C. Philip Tegler, who is the Executive Director of the Poverty and Race Research Action Council, which most of you know as PRAC. And Dr. Raymond Winbush. He is the Research Professor and Director of the Institute for Urban Research at Morgan State University. Thank you all so much for being here today. Mirta, I'd like to begin with you because particularly your work, you get to see firsthand the trauma of eviction through your work with your clients. Can you tell everyone a little bit about what you're seeing on the ground right now, and based on your experiences and your work on the ground, what it is you think needs to be done to break the cycle of eviction once and for all?
Oh, yeah. Serious question. So again, my name is Mirta. I am the Chief Program Officer at Riseboro, and just to very briefly tell you about Riseboro, is a community-based organization in Brooklyn, New York City. We provide services in the neighborhoods of Bushwick, Bedside, East New York, Brownsville, and Williamsburg, for those that have the geographic frame of reference for neighborhoods in New York City. So I've worked in homelessness and eviction prevention for several years. I was one of the people with several eviction warriors who built the home-based program, which is the eviction prevention program for New York City. I still am very connected to the program, even though it's overseen by a vice president of the division. I'm very connected because basically that is where my roots start. In addition, I also oversee our Right to Counsel program here at Riseboro, the ERAP, the Emergency Rental Assistance Program, and we do enrollment and outreach to people in the 5 boroughs, and also a specific program called Project Parachute that provides eviction prevention services to undocumented workers. And what I could tell you, what I've learned, the insights that I've had for the last 15 years is that our eviction prevention programs do really work. Home-based is a research-based program, for example, that for many, many years have prevented thousands of evictions in the city of New York, have prevented thousands of people from entering the shelter. But through many years, I've realized that these programs, what they do is crisis intervention. The programs are set up in a way in which by the time a client shows up in our door, and we are really embedded in a community with 4 neighborhood-based offices to do eviction and homelessness prevention. But by the time they show up to our doors, they are a desperate need of eviction prevention. And throughout the years, I've asked myself, why do we see the revolving door? Why do we see the client today that comes back the next year? And the idea of upstream prevention, how can we prevent people from even being in that situation? Very briefly, I just, before I talk about some of the interventions we're using here at Riseborough, I want to just set up some framework, especially for New York City, and I think it's probably the case for most major cities in this country. The majority, and when I'm speaking about the majority, I'm speaking about 90+% of people, especially in the family homelessness situation, that are experiencing homelessness are people that look like me. They are female, they are Black, sometimes they're immigrants, and for New York City, we're speaking about a Latino immigrant, and to be even more specific, we're talking about Latino immigrant from a African or indigenous descent. To me, it's extremely important to put this in front of the discussion of eviction prevention, because we have to acknowledge who is this crisis really affecting, and really acknowledge that the systems, programs, policies that we've established in this country, in this city for many years, for centuries, have really continued to oppress this very marginalized group of people. So that now that is kind of like the cat is out of the bag when it comes to eviction prevention, I just want to share very briefly some of the work we're doing here at Riseborough. We're doing some upstream work, working directly with public schools, identifying children who have had many absences in the last few months, and really learning is this because of housing instability, and really providing services that are around the child and how to help the child be successful in school. And the other intervention, we're calling it Zero Babies Homeless. That is, right now, we're still fundraising. This came out of a year worth of work, working with researchers, with community-based organization, and most importantly, with lived experience consultants. These are women who experience housing instability, let that be they lived in shelter or had to move from home to home when they were pregnant or when they had an infant. And after months of program design, the final recommendation, it kind of brings me back to Mayor Cantrell, I'm sorry, is that what the women, when we asked how would this situation be prevented, what they said was cash. So the Zero Babies Homeless would provide a no strings attached cash transfer to a group of women. We're looking for about 100 women, and really test if this is what does it. We've done programs and services for many years, but in their words, really what would prevent their situation, it would be a no strings attached cash.
Great. Thank you so much, Mirta, for your comments, but also just for putting, I think, a face to the numbers to really represent who is being served here, and just for all the work that you're doing at Riseborough. I want to move to Mary Cunningham now from the Urban Institute. Mary, you bring a lot of expertise on rental assistance, and in particular, you know so much about the Federal Emergency Rental Assistance Program. Can you share your observations about those types of programs like ERA and others, and how they do or don't prevent eviction and meet the specific financial needs of households?
Sure. Let me start by saying thanks to Enterprise for having me here. I thought I would talk a little bit about, the housing story that's coming out of the global pandemic. I want to make sure that we're learning the lessons, even as we struggle to end the pandemic. We need to make sure that we're learning the lessons that we have experienced throughout it. So going back to when the pandemic hit and the economy shut down, we had a really weak housing safety net with millions of people who were homeless or precariously housed. At that time, already about 3 million eviction filings per year. Unfortunately, those housing challenges don't affect all of us equally due to our country's history with systemic and structural racism, including redlining, housing discrimination, segregation. As a result of all of those policies, people of color disproportionately face eviction and homelessness. And this was the case before the pandemic. But I think really for the first time, housing, or more notably the threat of eviction, became a headline. I heard quite a few times before the pandemic or during the pandemic that we didn't have a national infrastructure for preventing evictions. And it's true, we were woefully unprepared and underfunded. But in fact, we do have solutions. We already had a system for helping low-income renters. That's the Federal Housing Choice Voucher program. But because of underfunding, only 1 in 5 households who qualified for assistance received it. And to be clear, the Housing Choice Voucher program is an evidence-based program. It works. Vouchers reduce evictions and homelessness and help people stay in their housing. And the research also shows that vouchers have benefits that go well beyond housing, including reducing poverty and well-being. So if housing assistance were available to everyone who qualified before the pandemic, managing that sudden loss of income or that big medical expense would have been easier to navigate. Households could have notified public housing authorities and they would have adjusted the rent, and then the government would have paid the difference. But unfortunately, as we all know, that's not what happened. After the first cases of COVID-19 appeared in the US in early 2020, it took Congress almost a year to provide assistance to renters. The first tranche of aid, significant assistance. The first tranche of aid came with $25 billion, which was passed in December 2020. It was followed by another $22 billion allocated in March 2021. These are ERA 1 and 2. And Treasury guidance followed in February and May 2021. So we're only recently starting to see this money go out the door. And this was despite Treasury getting the funds out quickly to states and localities. But these states and localities had to set up programs, which takes time. And many state and local jurisdictions didn't have assistance programs before the pandemic. Just to give you a sense of a comparison in terms of how fast this is all moving, a similar rental relief program from the Great Recession, the Homelessness Prevention and Rapid Rehousing Program, which was considered quickly implemented when it obligated $1.5 billion in 7 months and dispersed those dollars in 2 years. So by comparison, right now with ERA, states and local programs have dispersed $10 billion between March and September 2021, helping 1.9 million renters. So these programs are really being stood up quickly. Unfortunately, they're not moving fast enough, and that's because we really needed them at the beginning of the pandemic. And there's been tremendous suffering in evictions, both for tenants and landlords in terms of financial hardship. While we've seemed to head off the worst of the predictions, millions of people evicted when the eviction moratorium was lifted. That's what people predicted, the sort of tsunami, as people called it. It didn't happen. And many people are now asking why it didn't happen. And that is for 3 reasons. 1, the eviction moratorium worked. 2, unemployment benefits and stimulus checks, i.e. cash assistance, helped people pay the rent. And also emergency rental assistance helped people head off evictions and still is helping people head off evictions. We're still in a housing crisis. Over 3.5 million renters believe they'll be evicted in the next 2 months. So there's billions of dollars still out there, and landlords who need to get paid. And I think this presents a tremendous opportunity to use these dollars, not only to keep people housed, but to also end racial disparities in housing outcomes. So communities should be getting rental assistance out the door more quickly by really reaching out to all those who are eligible and marketing to historically marginalized communities, allowing for self-attestation for all eligibility requirements, really streamlining the application process. and providing rental assistance in the courts through eviction diversion programs. And they should be doing that and thinking about how to target and address racial inequities. The Urban Institute developed an emergency rental assistance priority tool. It's called ERAP, and it helps local leaders conduct outreach and allocate emergency rental assistance to neighborhoods where low-income renters have historically been marginalized and face the greatest risk of housing instability. And I can share that. So just looking towards the future for our next pandemic, dare I say, or disaster, I think the biggest lesson we've learned is we need a stronger housing safety net upstream. We need a universal housing voucher program. And the Urban Institute modeled what a housing choice voucher program for everyone eligible would cost. It would go to about 8.2 million households and cost about $62 billion per year. To me, that number doesn't seem so big anymore. I hope that we'll see a significant expansion of housing vouchers in upcoming congressional actions. This, of course, should be done simultaneously with the expansion of housing units. But as we imagine our vision for the future with a strong safety net, I do think it includes universal housing vouchers, but it also should include national source of income protections. Landlords' participation is critical to the success of any rental assistance program that relies on the private market. Unfortunately, we know that landlords in many areas reject house voucher holders at high rates, and many are rejecting emergency rental assistance. I think we also need to consider different forms of assistance, including cash assistance. We learned from the pandemic that giving people cash, either through unemployment or stimulus, can help them stay housed. And I think we should consider that as one of the tools in our toolbox. And really one way to also help prevent discrimination, provide more choice, make the subsidy less visible, give more power to the tenant and less power to the landlord in deciding where people should be able to rent their apartments. So I hope those are the lessons that we draw from the pandemic, that we have an ongoing housing crisis and we really need a strong housing safety net to make sure that we address it. Thanks.
Thank you, Mary. That was fantastic. Financial assistance is so critical to housing stability and economic mobility. And I think some of those opportunities you identified are really promising. Phil, I want to shift gears slightly and go over to you and talk about your work at PRAC. Some of our previous panelists have talked about racial equity, source of income protections. And so I'm thinking about all of the work that your organization does on fair housing and source of income discrimination with a racial equity lens. Tell us how you're connecting all of that work to eviction prevention.
Sure. Thanks for having me. Yeah, I think I wanted to talk primarily about the use of fair housing tools to prevent eviction. And first place to start on that is, of course, source of income discrimination laws. You know, we have a compilation of source of income discrimination laws around the country up on our website at PRAC. Currently, there's 16 states and almost 100 local jurisdictions that have source of income discrimination laws preventing discrimination on the basis of receipt, for example, of government housing funds. This covers almost half of the renters in the United States currently. And many of these laws include really broad language, protecting tenants on the basis of receipt of rental assistance. So it's a common phrase used, or reference to housing subsidies, housing assistance, or public assistance. The point of this this broad language is that it can be applied directly to emergency rental assistance funds. Several states have already put out explicit guidance indicating that refusal to take emergency rental assistance funds constitutes source of income discrimination under the state law. Specifically, New Jersey, Massachusetts, New York, and California have put out guidance on this. If you're in a state or local jurisdiction that has a source of income discrimination law, particularly one with this kind of broad language. You can use a source of income discrimination law potentially as an affirmative defense in an eviction action, or proactively as a claim in your local human rights office to prevent an eviction in advance, or to enjoin an eviction. Importantly now, HUD is reimbursing local fair housing organizations receiving HUD Fair Housing Initiative funds for their work on testing and enforcement of source of income discrimination laws. And so your local fair housing center, if you're in a jurisdiction with source of income discrimination protections, can be an important partner in enforcing these laws and requiring landlords to accept emergency rental assistance fund and forestalling evictions in that way. We have some advocacy tips that we developed with the National Housing Law Project and the National Homelessness Law Center that spell this out in more detail up on our website. And I recommend that to everyone. So that's like the more immediate thing. Moving on to the Fair Housing Act, which obviously applies everywhere in the United States. The people have spoken already on this webinar about the racial impacts of the eviction crisis. This has been well documented by the Eviction Lab, the National Low Income Housing Coalition, Urban Institute, and others. I won't go through all the statistics. They've been mentioned by some folks, but clearly Black renters are more subject to eviction filings, much higher rates. Women of color are the most likely to be evicted. Families with children are 3 times as likely to be evicted as families without children. The Eviction Lab lets you dig down into the county level to look at the rates in your area. In many parts of the country, there's even finer grained data based on a city or town level. What do we do with this data? What can people do with this data? I think the first and most important thing is policy advocacy. Highlighting the disproportionate rates of eviction affecting people of color in your jurisdiction, triggers the affirmatively furthering fair housing obligation. Affirmatively furthering fair housing is obviously about, desegregation and racial integration in housing, but it's also about pushing back against policies on practices that have a discriminatory impact. And your jurisdiction has a responsibility to affirmatively further fair housing in the eviction context, as well as in other contexts affecting housing. We're expecting a new regulation to come out soon on affirmatively furthering housing, but the legal obligation is there right now in your jurisdiction. And this can be a real platform for advocacy. What can a local jurisdiction do? Right to counsel is really up there at the top of the list. And Philadelphia, for example, used the affirmatively furthering fair housing process 5 years ago or so to really increase the right to counsel in Philadelphia. Tenant opportunity to purchase laws, sealing eviction records, passing source of income discrimination laws if the jurisdiction doesn't have that yet. A number of tenant protections at the state level, for example, just cause eviction in state law is another way to implement the affirmatively furthering fair housing obligation. Beyond that, in individual eviction actions, I would say it's more difficult to bring a fair housing claim or defense, but it is possible. If you have, well, first of all, I think as advocates, if it's possible to call out property owners that practice harsher eviction practices in African-American or Latino neighborhoods versus white neighborhoods, that can be a very effective strategy. And recently, the Joint Center for Housing Studies found evidence of harsher eviction practices taking place in majority African-American neighborhoods. Harsher practices like refusal to negotiate the rent, higher late fees, and following through with eviction as opposed to a rent forgiveness. In an individual eviction filing, of course, to raise fair housing as an affirmative claim, you would need some evidence that other families in the property, other families are being treated differently than the family being evicted. For example, rent repayment arrangements, forgiveness of late fees, acceptance of emergency rental assistance funds. If landlords are treating white tenants, for example, differently than Black tenants in this regard or any other regard, it creates the potential for an affirmative defense in states where affirmative defenses are permitted. So that's a range of fair housing tools that can be used to prevent evictions. Source of income discrimination laws, policy advocacy based on affirmatively furthering fair housing, and individual claims of fair housing discrimination in eviction actions. So I will pass it on and see you later.
Thank you so much, Phil. It's just really important to have this context so that we're leading with racial equity and thinking about source of income when we look at the root causes of eviction and then the corresponding solutions. Dr. Winbush, on that note, and thinking through all of the racial equity considerations that our previous panelists have brought forth as a lens for looking at their work, I wonder if you can take our audience a little deeper into the historic and extreme disenfranchisement of Black Americans in the housing market and make some of the connections between reparations, which is in your area of expertise, and upstream eviction prevention.
Well, thank you very much. I'll probably say a couple of things that will, raise some eyebrows, but I think it needs to be said. Let's talk about the first mass eviction of Black people in this country. It occurred on April 15th, 1865, the day after Abraham Lincoln was assassinated at Ford's Theater, not too far from where I am now in Baltimore. Andrew Johnson became president, and at that time, some 400,000 acres of land had been allocated, the 40 acres and a mule of Field Order Number 15, to Black people in the Sea Islands off the coast of Georgia, as well as South and North Carolina. Andrew Johnson, even though people had been settled on this land, Black people had been settled on this land, he said that the people who had suffered most during the Civil War were the slave owners. And he took the 400,000 acres and gave all of that back to the slave owners and evicted, if you please, those Black residents who were on that land. Frankly, it's been downhill ever since then. We've tried, set-asides, we've tried affirmative actions. It has led me to believe that the only real solution to some of the evictions that we're seeing now, as well as other inequities, racial inequities in the society, is reparations. I was glad to hear several of you mention the issue of giving cash payments. We know that during the pandemic, as one speaker said, that cash payments work. People do responsible things with them. And we have some empirical evidence of that in the cities of Compton, California, as well as in Stockton, California, where money was literally given to people, and found out that they didn't waste it, as we think the poor will do and the Black will do on buying a Cadillac or doing other things like that. But they actually paid off bills, got out of debt, and so forth. So we know the cash payments work. I think in the area of that policymakers simply fail to do is ask the question, why? I mean, why are there evictions in the first place? And we'll usually attribute it to something where they don't have enough money. And more racist people will say, well, these people just aren't capable of managing their own bank accounts and so forth. Here in Baltimore, where I live, there was an area, there is an area called Sandtown, Winchester, which in the 1930s was the most sought after Black community in this in the city of Baltimore, really in the state of Maryland. It is the same community where Freddie Gray was killed by police in 2015. The people who used to live in that area, you know, comprised everyone from Duke Ellington lived there a little while, Langston Hughes, the poet, lived there a little while. Thurgood Marshall was actually born there. And so, you have an area that from the 1930s being like the Gold Coast, if you please, middle-class Black folk, to what you have now, one of the most impoverished areas in this city and indeed in the state, but nobody ever asked the question why. You know, I always think with regards to Black people that we start reading the book in the middle of the book rather than the first page of the book. And the first page of the book are those evictions that occurred on April 15th, 1865. I am all for cash payments as a form of reparations to people who have been evicted or are getting ready to be evicted. And I've actually worked out some numbers, but I don't want to, you know, blur the the presentation with that. I also think that we, you know, Americans in general tend to minimize the issue of racism when it comes to talking about any inequities, you know, about Black folk in this country. We prefer explanations that say there's something wrong with them rather than saying there's something wrong with the system. And actually, you know, paradoxically, it was probably easier to do that on April 15th, 1865, because you knew that Andrew Johnson said, look, you Black folk get off, and I'm sure he didn't use that word, but you Black folk get off the land, and we're going to give this land to white people. We're going to evict you, if you please. And I think it was actually easier then to understand how racism impacts decisions that are being made than it is now. All of us know, especially in housing, the whole issue of redlining, which wasn't really, even though it was a policy, we didn't know how it impacted Black folk. I think when we talk about reparations, people usually say things to me like, well, that's an extraordinary solution. Why don't we just, you know, put a little program here or put a little program there? In fact, enslavement was extraordinary, and the impact of enslavement into this country is still felt today in many, many ways. And I think that we have to start addressing the issue of racism and then provide cash payments for those who are about to be evicted, as well as cash payments to those who have been evicted from their property. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Dr. Winbush. I think you've raised some really important points and considerations for us, and I'm really particularly interested in how cash has come up in everyone's remarks. Really, it's just you know, clearly, the deeper we go into the root causes and the true needs is cash in people's pockets. So it's very interesting to see how all of your remarks kind of came together. So this is a great time to move to Q&A. So we're going to bring actually all the panelists up with me. I had quite a few questions lined up, but the questions in the Q&A are fantastic, better than anything I have. So I actually want to go to the attendees' questions, and I'm going to read a couple of them. And they're just, you know, in reaction to all of the great remarks we heard. So let me just dive right in. The first question I'm going to ask, I think, is maybe addressed a little bit to Mary. So I'll probably have Mary jump in, and then I will open it to other panelists if you want to add anything. But the question is, what are some of the limitations of the Emergency Rental Assistance Program, and how would you address them? Is one of the major challenges that agencies are so overwhelmed with applications, leading to slow processing?
Yes. Yes. I mean, I think, as I said in my sort of opening remarks, we were woefully unprepared for really responding to this crisis. And instead of just being able to flip the switch and having sort of a social insurance program through housing vouchers or some other housing mechanism, we, jurisdictions across the country had to stand up programs overnight. And unfortunately, one of the ways that we administer housing assistance is through a really arduous process of documentation and verification. We don't trust applicants. And there's also, making sure that the landlord is also presenting documentation. So I think that, it's not only that the jurisdictions are overwhelmed, but it's that we could be streamlining the applications significantly. We already know there are waiting lists years long on housing authority PHAs waiting for housing. Let's go to those folks who we know qualify probably for, by income for emergency rental assistance. Let's just streamline applications by allowing people to self-attest to all of the eligibility requirements. That is the way to get the money out the door. It's not only the way to prevent tenant suffering, but also to make sure that landlords, many who are mom and pop landlords, don't go out of business. So we need to do more to get that money out the door faster. And I think the Treasury guidance allows for a lot of that streamlining, and communities may just be hesitant to take advantage of it. And I really want to encourage them and push them to do it.
Thank you, Mary. Do any of the other panelists want to comment on that?
I'd like just to add something really quickly, and just to addressing kind of how so many of these policies criminalize the person living in poverty. We administer the ERAP program here in the city of New York, and what I've heard from so many people who are applying, self-attestation, Mary, this is the nail for the most part. But just to add something else is, why can't this money go directly to the tenant? This consistent need that we are checking and double checking and triple checking that the person is not going to take this money and buy a Cadillac. It's unnecessary. People are going, if the money went directly to the tenant, they would use it to pay the rent.
That's such a great point. Thank you, Mirta. Okay, there's another question I want to get to, and Phil, I'm going to direct this question to you, but again, I'd like any of the other panelists to chime in. The question is on the issue of source of income discrimination. This person says, I've heard anecdotally from a friend who works in housing case management that she's seeing landlords avoid serving potential tenants with vouchers by just avoiding them or their case manager's calls of saying, whoops, it's already been rented. Do you foresee potential for different tools to enforce SOI discrimination prohibitions, such as looking at a landlord's overall rental rate to voucher holders?
Well, on that last point, that's very hard to do because the data is not public. And but a housing authority can certainly flag properties that don't have vouchers that are within the payment standard. But to respond to your question, I refer back to the major Urban Institute study that was done 3 years ago or 4 years ago for HUD on basically discrimination against voucher holders around the country. And there was a dramatic evidence of source of income discrimination across the country. And one jurisdiction really stood out, the Washington, D.C. area, had very low rates of discrimination against voucher holders. Why was that? Now, it's probably because there was a really strong and public systemic enforcement effort in Washington, D.C. over a period of years. It was the Washington Lawyers Committee did that. They got big money damages awards. They did systemic testing of landlords. It was all very public, and the basically Landlords in Washington, D.C. know that this is not allowed and they'll be caught and prosecuted for. And that's really the answer to your question. I think that you have to have that kind of systemic enforcement. This, you know, a lot of fair housing organizations around the country are doing more of this now, especially now that HUD is supporting it with, you know, reimbursing that work. The Housing Rights Initiative in New York has been doing this work around New York State and now recently in Virginia, where they were doing systemic testing of landlords. And I think there's a dozen cases now being prosecuted by the Virginia Attorney General's office. You know, we need more aggressive work like that. You know, and I think the Attorney General's offices are a good place to, you know, put pressure on. If where there's a state source of income discrimination law and it's being ignored, systemic testing and enforcement has to happen. And the results, I think, will be similar to what we saw in Washington, D.C. The property owners will get in line and follow the law.
Do any of the other panelists want to add on to that, the question about source of income?
I would just add that we need national protections. I mean, I do think jurisdictions across the country have adopted them. Many are moving towards adopting them. You know, not only as Phil just pointed out, do we need the protections, but we need enforcement. And, you know, the statistics on Washington, D.C. were that about 15% of landlords rejected voucher holders. And that's with protections. That was much lower, though, compared to places like Los Angeles, which rejects 78% of landlords were rejecting voucher holders, and Fort Worth, 74% were rejecting. You know, really, really big numbers. And so we need first the protections and then enforcement, and a lot of legal advocacy behind those protections. So.
And of course, talking about housing vouchers, sorry, Ray.
No, go ahead, Phil.
Equally important is implementation of small area fair market rents, as they're called, higher rent caps in more expensive neighborhoods. If you can't even afford the rent in a neighborhood, the issue of discrimination never even comes up. And public housing authorities have the right to do that. You know, as a matter of right now, they don't need permission. And too few housing authorities are implementing those higher rent caps. And that needs to be a focus of advocacy as well.
You know, I mean, I'm going to get philosophical for a moment, but what we're really asking on this question is, how do you get rid of racism? I don't think it is going to get, it's not going to leave us. Like, I don't think 50 years from now, we're going to say, remember when we had racism in housing, you know, back in the 2100s or whatever. It's not going to happen. So you got to have constant enforcement. You know, and for the, you know, for Black and brown folk, the government and attorneys generals have been kind of, you know, fickle lovers in terms of enforcing the law. We're going to see a lot of that next year in the 2022 elections about just voting. So, you know, I think, again, it shows, you know, we got to ask the question, how do you deal with the consistency of racism in the society, especially as it relates to housing?
Thank you, Dr. Winbush. It's, you know, really an intersection of discrimination in individuals, racism in individuals, with racism built into the system. So while we're talking about vouchers, there's a question here, and it's actually related to a question I have. So the person says, in regards to housing choice vouchers, a massive expansion of Section 8 would help, but how would we address dysfunction within voucher administrators? I think they mean public housing authorities. But more broadly, something I'm wondering is, you know, there's been this big push for universal vouchers. And given all the problems, the lack of source of income discrimination at the federal level, what do you all feel, how do you all feel about expanding housing choice vouchers, especially a universal expansion? In your mind, is that the answer, or will that sort of overshadow what's really needed to address some of the root causes? And I'll just open that up to anyone who wants to take that. Mirta?
I could start. And so I do agree that that universal Section 8 would solve some issues. But we go back to the same problem as to there is a Black woman holding a Section 8 voucher.
Mhm.
So now there are, for landlords, there's assumptions, preconceived assumptions, biases that this person has or this company has about what is a Black woman holding a voucher, why is she holding this voucher? So can Section 8, I agree completely with Mary, is a research-based program that it prevent evictions. But when we're talking about the root cause, what I would like to see, and I really do believe that this is the future of helping people living in poverty, is even small pilots providing direct cash, how much a Section 8 voucher is worth for a family of 5, and just sending that person that cash. And test it, and let's test it to see if that person is going to use that money to pay their rent. And we could be doing this parallel as some people have the traditional Section 8 voucher, and see what are the outcomes from that experiment.
Great, go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, so in terms of universal vouchers, I mean, currently in most metropolitan areas, there's rental housing that exists across a very wide area of the metropolitan area, but vouchers seem to be concentrated in the lower cost parts, which are often at the center of the metro area. You know, with universal vouchers, there's a real risk of just intensifying that kind of concentration and segregation. And Congresswoman Waters, who is chair of the Financial Services Committee, in her universal voucher bill that was introduced this year, she addresses that issue in 3 important ways. One, as Mary mentioned, universal source of income, national source of income discrimination protection. Secondly, small area fair market rents, basically mandatorily increasing the rent caps throughout metropolitan areas to meet the market. So if you have a suburban rental complex, you can get into it with the higher rents. And thirdly, mobility counseling assistance and landlord incentives, basically services to help families find housing in neighborhoods they're not familiar with, potentially giving families greater choices where in a metropolitan area to live. So those things, I think, have to go hand in hand with universal vouchers to make them successful, or else we're just going to be putting just so much pressure on the existing lower cost housing, which other families may need as well.
Yeah, that's such an important consideration, especially now that everyone's talking about universal vouchers. Dr. Winbush, I have a question here for you, and of course, open it to all the panelists. It says here, you clearly laid out the justification for reparations given the depth of historic injustice and how that history impacts current disparities. Can you say more about how reparations could be structured, including any examples that are based around housing?
Well, first of all, you got to get HR 40 unstuck in the House of Representatives. It's ironic that we got it to the floor after being, introduced by John Conyers in 1989 on April 14th of this year, which is ironically the day that, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. You've got to get that out of committee. I just got an email this morning that we're at 210 votes, so we're 8 short of getting it to the floor for a vote. And ironically, I'm saying this here, and I know there's going to be blowback, but the person who's preventing it from getting to the floor is a guy by the name of James Clyburn, which is really ironic. It's not Nancy Pelosi, believe it or not, it's James Clyburn. So if you want to call him and say that Ray Winbush told him to call you, be my guest. The implementation of reparations, very quickly, there are discussions about having a reparations bank. It's ironic, again, I'm probably stepping on somebody's toes, but JPMorgan was a predecessor bank and used, sold enslaved people during the Civil War and even before that. We have to dig in, to those histories of those banks, those institutions, and look at how they benefited from enslavement, and then decide how it should be allocated. Catholic, what's the Catholic University in DC? I'm blocking the name of it, but the Georgetown University had sold 271 people, enslaved people. They should pay reparations. So, it's going to be an uncomfortable process. It's going to be a process that, digs, it will dig a lot of bones out of the ground, literally as well as figuratively, but it has to be implemented.
Yeah, these are really important conversations that are painful but need to be had. I'm going to shift gears slightly because there are quite a few questions related to legal services. So in the eviction process, I want to talk a little bit about, access to counsel or right to counsel, whatever you want to call it. There are some questions here that are specifically asking whether ERAP, the Emergency Rental Assistance Program, can be used for legal services, but also more broadly, what the group thinks or what you've seen or experienced in terms of the impact of having access to counsel in eviction proceedings. Do you think it's the best opportunity to prevent eviction? How does it tie into housing stability, and how can it help different populations, including returning citizens? So Mary, maybe you could start with the ERAP program and how it, if and how it can be used for legal services, and then others can chime in with their thoughts on right to counsel.
Sure. So up to about 10% of ERA funds can be used for housing stability services, and that includes some legal services. That is a part of emergency rental assistance program. I mean, I think that we've seen a lot of strong evidence around right to counsel and protecting people from evictions. I think it's also, I think it needs to all work in combination with each other, right? You need to have legal representation, but you also need to have rental assistance to help mediate with the landlord, keep the person in the household, provide the back rent and rent arrears so that the landlord will help the tenant stay or allow the tenant to stay. And if not, that you can at least negotiate with the landlord to let the tenant walk away without the mark of an eviction or without the scar of bad rental history on their record. So I think legal representation is really, really important. It's really important to be done in combination with rental assistance. It used to be that we didn't have those resources, but now we do through ERA. So communities should certainly be standing up programs that are either inside the courts or court adjacent to help make sure that people are not facing eviction.
Right. And right to counsel alone won't fix the problem, but combined with resources can have a huge impact. Mirta, did you want to jump in?
Yes. So New York City have had right to counsel for now 5 years or a little bit longer than that. It was being rolled out slowly, zip codes by zip codes. COVID made it so that everyone had access to counsel. We Riceboro actually operate a universal access to counsel program. I could tell you that in the city, prior to what we call UA, getting a lawyer to represent you in housing court was as good as winning the lottery. Almost 90% of landlords were represented by counsel when only about 10% of tenants were received the same representation. So now there is our current mayor is still the current mayor. De Blasio put in millions of dollars into universal access, and the services are being provided in housing court. That, in combination with our eviction prevention home-based program, provides all of the or many of the services that Mary described, advocating with the landlord, making sure you're checking rental ledgers, having that lawyer representing you in housing court. And for New York City, it has decreased significantly the number of evictions. You could see if you look at the number of evictions starting in 2012, which is probably when the city had the largest number, and you see it decreasing. But it's not only universal access to counsel. In the summer of 2019, the city added significant protections for tenants, which made it much more difficult for a landlord to evict somebody. So it is a combination of all of these things to be really on the offense constantly when it comes to preventing an eviction. It's very expensive. I usually tell people also, law schools have not graduated the number of lawyers that is needed. So operationally, it's very challenging to go from, the city had maybe $10 million for legal assistance in housing to $60 million and several lawyers. So I encourage any locality that is thinking about it to really think about from the perspective of the provider and how to operationalize it in a way that it doesn't drive people crazy, which is what's happening, I could say, for many of these staff attorneys representing hundreds of clients here in New York City.
Great point. Thanks, Mirza. We also have a lot of questions that are continuing to come in, asking for everyone's thoughts on vouchers and some of the sort of systemic barriers, because there are, as you know, many other challenges to utilizing a voucher beyond just source of income. What's mentioned here in the questions are, for example, when a landlord maybe asks for 2 months rent as a deposit, creating a barrier there, or landlords who are able to sort of legally deny voucher holders by basically not maintaining their unit to code or to the Section 8 inspection standards. What have you seen localities do to address these barriers? And are there any laws that can be implemented to make sure that these barriers aren't faced in the first place?
Well, landlords do have the right to charge a security deposit. There are in Build Back Better, the reconciliation bill currently in Congress, there's funding for security deposits. Also, HUD has should have the flexibility, but they haven't exercised it yet, to permit housing authorities to use housing funds for security deposits and help families in that way. But other than that, there's nothing much to do about it unless you can convince your state government state legislature to outlaw security deposits, which I think is highly unlikely. The code enforcement thing you mentioned, the Section 8 housing quality standards aren't very different from local housing codes. And so I really think, that's on the municipality or the county to enforce their housing code, because that will, if the landlord, is in compliance with the local housing code, he's probably likely to be in compliance with the Section 8 code as well. So I don't have anything more to say about that. I recognize the problem that the listener is pointing out. That's about code enforcement more than anything else.
Mhm. And just enforcement in general. I mean, even, going back to source of income, that yes, states in particular, but also localities who implement source of income protections need to back it up with funding for enforcement. That can always be a real challenge, maybe even a bigger challenge than the protections themselves. I have a question that I want to ask, starting with Dr. Winbush, but it's actually a question for all of the panelists. It's around political will. I thought, Dr. Winbush, you spoke very eloquently about reparations. And then as the question goes to the other panelists, just thinking about some of the upstream prevention strategies that you touched upon. Where are there barriers in political will, and what are your thoughts on what advocates and policymakers need to do to sort of meet politicians or policymakers where they are, particularly elected officials, and to make the case that these are worthwhile investments? Because a lot of what we're talking about here are large financial investments. And how do you propose or think about making the case that it's an investment that has an ROI? Not that the ROI has to be in the dollar form, but how do you make the case to politicians that these are good investments?
Well, I think it was John F. Kennedy that made a distinction between politicians and statespeople. He said politicians were worried about, getting reelected, and statespeople were worried about the country. And I think right now we're seeing an era where people are more concerned about getting elected. I think, and I don't want to sound pessimistic, but I think we're in a dangerous place right now in this country. I mean, we're seeing death threats to Republicans who voted for Biden's infrastructure bill that he signed yesterday. And I think that we're moving in a direction where people are more concerned. I mean, politicians should always be concerned about what their constituents are saying, but they also have to have the courage to tell their constituents sometimes that they're wrong about things. And a lot of politicians lack that courage right now. So political will right now is really, I don't want to say it's almost non-existent, but it's on its way to being non-existent if we keep having these polarizing politics. That's the only reason why H.R. 40, which I mentioned earlier about the reparations bill, has not gotten out of committee, or it's gotten out of committee, but it's not gotten to the floor for a vote.
Right. Thanks, Dr. Winbush. Mirta, Phil, Mary, do you want to jump in with your thoughts on creating political will? Go ahead, Phil.
Well, not so much on political will, but in broader response to your question, there's a lot of money being invested in housing at the federal and state level, and potentially even more coming if we can pass the reconciliation bill. It's going to be important over the next 5 to 10 years to invest as much of that money in social housing sector, the nonprofit, the community-based, community land trusts, limited equity co-ops, all the ways in which you're taking housing out of the profit-motivated sort of commodity sector. And what we've seen in COVID recently, and the rent spikes that have gone on, you see the problem with profit-motivated housing investments. And because the rents are just got, it's the law of supply and demand, and that law does not apply to nonprofit and social housing. And so the more we can transfer into that sector in the long run, the better off we'll all be.
That's a great point. Thanks, Phil. Mirta, you want to jump in?
Yes. So I think that we have to be willing to try things that haven't been tried before. For decades, the way to address issues related to poverty and housing instability is to do a little voucher here, to do a little bit of money here. So trying things that are and in thinking about COVID actually demonstrated that we could do things that before, I mean, what happened in April, if you think about 2 months before, everybody would say, what do you mean there could be enhanced unemployment benefits? What do you mean that people could receive a stimulus check? What do you mean that there could be enhanced SNAP benefits? So if anything, COVID proved to many of us and hopefully to policymakers is that there are different ways to addressing these issues and continuing to doing the same thing because we've done it like that and this is in the system and it's hard to stop the system. It's really not sustainable really for this country.
Mary, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree. I really want to co-sign that. I mean, I found the housing story of the pandemic really discouraging, that we sent all the money to Treasury and not HUD, and that was for political reasons. That is why we did not put it through some of our existing channels. That was all political. And so not data-based, we had evidence that shows that we have some programs that work. So I do think thinking about alternatives to, in conjunction with looking at the impacts of universal housing vouchers and the solutions that could come out of that. I also think we do need to think, going back to my sort of opening, about cash assistance, alternatives to housing programs, the child tax credit, renter tax credits, just giving people more cash and assistance can help go a long way. So I think thinking about that as alternatives that may be more politically feasible is really important. And then, of course, because I'm a researcher, I think we have to continue to show the cost of homelessness, the cost of eviction, the cost of doing nothing, and then what the return on investment is, and really identify programs that work and that really change people's life outcomes, because I think housing does that.
Yeah, and I think pilots, right, are a really great way to build will, because it was Mayor Tubbs who had the courage to create the UBI program and invest in it. And that's why Mayor Cantrell was on today talking about their pilot. Somebody stood up and experimented with something we've been talking for so long and was able to show that it works. And then it just kind of spreads like wildfire. So we probably have time for like 1 or 2 more questions, and it's hard to pick questions because we're just getting such great ones from the audience. But I want to ask, this is going to kind of go a little further off topic than we've gone, but I want to ask a question about home ownership. And Mirta, I'm going to maybe put you on the spot first and then open it up to others. But I wanted to ask you first, because you're doing so much direct engagement with clients. And in these conversations, everyone's been talking about direct cash assistance, and indirectly, we're also talking about economic mobility and wealth building, right? And so you see a lot of clients, most of whom are being evicted because they're renters and they don't have the stability of home ownership. So should we be talking about and thinking about home ownership in this context? It is of course one of the major ways of building wealth in this country. It is of course one of the ways in which wealth has been denied to people of color, but could it also be another way of also thinking about keeping people stable and out of eviction? So I just want your perspective from your work with your clients, and then I'll open it up to others.
So I think that you've actually said almost everything I was going to say. I mean, owning a home really does open up generational wealth for so many. Our clients, and I am going to be 100% real now, owning a home in New York City, to so many of the people we serve here, Riseboro, it's almost a dream that they reject to put in their mind, because on a daily basis, they are living paycheck to paycheck, hoping that something doesn't fall through the cracks so that the eviction comes. So is it a solution? And maybe I'm too deep in the trenches, and and I see the realities of a city that is extremely wealthy, but that continues to push and oppress certain people. I don't even know how that would be possible in this city. And I'm just being very, very, very honest. I wish I could say, yes, let's buy homes for everyone. But how do you do it in a city in which a single family home easily costs $700,000? And how do you qualify for a mortgage when you're making minimum wage, which for New York City is $15 an hour, but it's impossible to pay a rent of $1,600 with a full-time job of $15 an hour. So the systemic issues, the lack of credit or the bad credit, also that all of it is very systemic, has barriers upon barriers upon barriers upon barriers for the people living in poverty in the city.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the prices are just out of reach. Dr. Winbush, were you going to jump in here?
Right. Mirtha, I didn't want to go where she went, but she's gone there, and I want to go there with her on that, because I think that all public housing, people associate public housing with poor people. They associate with brown people, Black people, and white people as well. There's got to be something built in. And, I had actually written all this stuff down, but I thought it was too complicated. There's got to be something in each public housing program and research in this direction that leads people to home ownership, even in places like New York City, as well as in places like as far away flung as Appalachia, Cleveland, Baltimore, my city. I think, wealth building, as you said, is the single, home ownership builds wealth better than anything in this country. And we know that. And it's been denied people of color for so many years. And I think that, I would love to see more public housing programs have some type of mechanism. Difficult though it may be, more complicated, it has to be thought out, but that they focus on, say, how do we get people from public housing into private homes?
Yep. Thank you, Dr. Winbush. Phil, Mary, any final thoughts on this topic?
Well, I would call out, especially in terms of the discussion on reparations and the racial wealth gap, resulting from segregation in the 20th century, that, the idea of down payment assistance for first generation home ownership, individuals whose families have never owned a home, that tends to be extremely targeted toward, Black and Latino folks who have not had a chance to build that wealth. And, several states have done that. It's in the Build Back Better package. That's like one of the most important things that we can do to support those first generation home ownership programs at the state and federal level.
Thank you, Phil. Mary, final word?
Yeah, I would say all of the things that people have said. We need to unlock homeownership for people who just need that down payment assistance, who have the incomes or close to the incomes to support that. But I also think we need to balance our housing policy and not provide all the rewards to homeowners, but also make sure that we're supporting renters and stabilizing renters, and then thinking about alternative ways to wealth building as well, because there are plenty of people who are in homes who get stuck in homes that don't build equity, and it's not the only mechanism. So I just want us to make sure that we're not only thinking about home ownership, but that we're balancing our housing policy and thinking about alternative ways to build wealth and overcome the wealth gap.
Thanks, Mary. We are at time. This was such a great conversation. First and foremost, I want to thank our panelists. You've all carved out time from your demanding schedules to talk to us about this really critical topic. And it's just been fantastic hearing all of your ideas, but I also want to thank our audience for joining us. I know all of you are out there doing the tireless work of protecting tenants, so thank you. Again, look out for the full release of our Upstream prevention tool. We will be emailing it to everyone who registered for the webinar. We'll also include a recording of this webinar, a blog post, and lots of other materials, including some of our previous webinars on the topic. So just a big thank you to everyone, and I hope you all have a great day.